Oh God, I'm the one who doesn't do single family houses.
I know. But I think we can, oh good, we have Nathan. Hi, Nathan. I assume we'll get more people joining here in the next couple of minutes. So let's just run through introductions. Katrina Manigan, Director of Buildings and Homes for Denver's Climate Office. Courtney.
Courtney Anderson on Katrina's Buildings team, focus on net zero energy.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom Gleason, Notes Guy.
I don't know that we have any of our CPD colleagues on here, so let's go through our stakeholders. And maybe they'll join in just a little bit. I know Mike Walton in particular had been tracking this and emailing us about it and such. So let's go to, oh good, I see actually Antonio. We'll go to Antonio. Do you want to say hi just to round out the city crowd?
Hello everyone, sorry I'm a few minutes late. Antonio Navarro, Senior Building Inspector, City of Denver.
Thank you. All right, Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan Ferdig, architect at Davis Partnership. Does my mic sound sort of blown out to you guys?
A little bit.
I'm getting a little weird. All right, I'll take a look at that while I'm going.
Yeah. Nathan. Nathan Skrdla. Want to say hi?
Oh, sorry about that. Nate Skrdla with Brookfield Residential.
Thank you. And Sean?
Sean Dennison, New Buildings Institute, Code Language Sweatshop.
Thank you, Sean. And our other Sean, I have to remember in this group to say last names with the Sean Lamont.
Yes, hi. Sorry, pulled off mute. This is Sean Lamons with Mitsubishi Electric Train and on the road, so I'm going back on mute.
Okay, let's get into our meeting. Oh, Robbie, say hi. I missed you.
Hi, this is Robbie Schwartz with Build Tank Inc. I'm part of the Noresco team that's helping to facilitate code development for the city of Denver.
Thank you, Robbie. Oh, and I just saw Christine join. Christine, do you want to say hi?
Hi, Christine Brinker with Southwest Energy Efficiency Project.
Did I miss anyone? I see Mike Walton's on now. Mike, you have to say hi. Mike Walton, I think you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Nope, I'm with you guys now. Yep, I'm Mike Walton. I'm with the Residential Planner.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so let's get right into our agenda. This is the third meeting of the residential working group working on residential proposals to send back to the IECC Code Committee in July for a vote. We want to start with the ERI proposal, since we haven't talked about that a lot yet. We've spent more time on the points proposal and the minimum renewable proposal as a group. So we'll start with the ERI proposal. We think that one had a lot less work that was needed, but I'd like to have Robbie Schwartz walk through the current proposal. It's a combination of two other proposals because they really just fit together, we realize, so it simplifies things to make them one proposal. So Robbie's going to walk through that. We'll talk about if there is anything that might need adjustment there, and then we'll go through what we hope are pretty close to final versions of the other two proposals. We're hoping that this working group might be able to wrap up today. If we need one more session, we can meet a fourth time in 2 weeks. All right, so Robbie, with that, and take it away.
Hi, Robbie Schwartz here. So if we start at the top of the proposal is looking at the R401 section, the application of the different compliance alternative pathways. There was a new compliance pathway added for the tropical climate zones, and we're just deleting that to clean up specifically for the city of Denver. And then we move down into the R401.2 .5 section, which is the additional energy efficiency options there. And we're striking number 3, which is specific to the energy rating index pathway, because we are setting the energy rating index compliance number before on-site renewables are included at 50. There's no need to use an additional energy efficiency option for that pathway. It helps clean up that pathway as well, so that our hope is that that pathway will be used more during the cycle of the code. That then brings us into the R406, or Energy Rating Index Compliance Alternative Pathway, which we have talked about in the past. The first part of this proposal is a little bit of that confusion with the 2021, in that they eliminated the language. They basically eliminated language that referred to prescriptive compliance and mandatory compliance. And basically in the prescriptive sections, everything has just become a requirement. And those things that are dealing with how you install something are required. And those things that are addressing R values or U values are able to be traded off. So because they did that, they created this table, the requirements table for the energy rating index compliance alternative, and also the building performance, or what used to be called the simulate performance path. This is just showing those sections in the R402 prescriptive section of the code that cannot be traded off because they're not dealing with R values or U values. They're things that are in essence mandatory. They are a requirement. The best example, you can look through this list, but the best example is the building thermal envelope attic eave baffles. So for example, if you're doing a performance compliance approach and you're building a ventilated attic, it's still a requirement to install eave baffles. And that was confusing with the language in the past, mandatory and prescriptive there, because that's a requirement that is, located in what we used to call the prescriptive section of the code. Moving down, we get into the true compliance pathway for R406. We've struck most of that at the beginning to align the energy rating index with the ResNet HERS, or really the ResNet ANSI 301 standard for how you generate an energy rating index score. And by doing that, we ensure that there's no meaningful discrepancy between the code energy rating index score and the HERS energy rating index score, or the one that ResNet creates, the home energy rating system, or HERS energy rating index score, so that there's less confusion amongst builders, energy raters, code officials, and it will hopefully streamline this process. In that section, R406.5, actually it's R406.4 now, energy-based compliance, we are making the energy rating index score that you need to achieve before on-site renewables are installed on the house, energy rating index of 50. This is the reason why we are striking the additional option package, because at this level of an index score, you have to build a solid building thermal envelope, and you also have to install higher efficiency mechanical systems in that house. So the energy rating index, the additional efficiency package really is redundant because of the level that we set the energy rating index at. The rest of the proposal is just, the only difference in the rest of the proposal is changing numbering of it. There's still requirements for verification and documentation submittals for both permitting the house and in order to get the certificate of occupancy. So nothing really has changed beyond this table here. think that's it.
Thanks so much, Robbie.
Yeah.
Does anyone have questions about what this proposal says, what it does? We'll start with kind of clarification questions. Might also say, you know, Sean, if there's anything. Yeah, I don't know, Sean, if there's anything you wanted to add also.
No, I think Robbie covered it well.
Okay, great. Okay, so if there's no clarifying questions, I'll just say, do folks think this looks good? Is it ready to go? Or is there anything that you think we should talk about further? Might need tweaks?
Robbie's a master.
He is. Okay. That is good to hear. I'll give another pause, but I'll take then quiet to mean that this group thinks that this proposal makes a lot of sense. I know that there's a couple of folks who have been participating in this working group who aren't here today, but I think we have a good turnout still, and I know this was sent to everyone in the working group. So we will call this one good to go.
I'm in the opposite boat where I missed the first two. So can you let me know, is this the main proposal on ERI or are there other proposals related to ERI?
Good question, Christine. This is the main proposal on ERI. Do you have anything you want to add though, Robbie?
That's correct. There are no other proposals that affect this compliance alternative.
Yeah.
Then a follow-up question, is there anything in the ERI pathway here that could be considered that would favor electrification? Or is that being handled before someone picks the ERI pathway? In other words, I'd heard of other communities that were setting a higher ERI level for electric and a lower ERI score for gas mixed fuel homes.
Electrification is being handled by a separate and unique proposal that's separate from this.
Robbie, and I think that's because, see if I get this right, but I think, Christine, that's because the minimum renewable proposal applies. Tell me if I get this wrong, Sean and Robbie, but I think the minimum renewable proposal applies to both buildings that follow the ERI path or buildings that follow the prescriptive path. Is that right? Yeah, and so we can pivot to that proposal now. Thanks for doing that. But this here you can see how this proposal. So this committee is reviewing 3 proposals. This proposal applies to both of the other 2 paths, where all electric is one of the ways that then you're exempt from having to do other things. And if you otherwise you have to do the renewables or buildings that, as you can see here, have to do that choose the ERI path have to achieve an ERI that is 17 points lower than the proposal we were just looking at, should they want to pursue efficiency in lieu of renewables or in lieu of being all electric.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, the other thing to consider is that the objective right now is to simplify, in essence, the ERI alternative approach so that hopefully more builders start to use that, and to, in essence, allow it to deal with the core efficiency of the house in the same way that the other compliance alternatives do, so that you're not adding additional confusion to the equation in one pathway.
I think I fell off when you guys were asking for input or questions on this. If I have an opportunity, Robbie, if this would be a good time.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so something that I always bring up, and we're constantly, looking at from, house cost standpoint on what buyers are willing to absorb in the market. And for those of you that noticed the 75 basis point interest rate that happened yesterday, house costs are constantly something that the market is telling us about, I guess. So Robbie, when you were scrolled down in this proposal, you had checked off no impact to house costs or design. And just curious on kind of how you get to that point when you're reducing your ERI score.
So you have an option of choosing one of the multiple compliance options that you want to choose. So you don't have to choose the energy rating index. And the objective right now is to get alignment with all of the different compliance pathways so that they're in alignment with the goals of what the city is. So in essence, one compliance pathway isn't increasing costs more than any other compliance pathway.
Sure, but if you weren't to lower the number from 55 to 50, the ERI pathway would be less expensive to achieve, right?
That's true, but what I'm talking about is the objective of the total code compliance. Sorry. The objective of the entire code development process for the 2021 in the city of Denver is to create equity between all of the different compliance pathways. So there should not be a cost difference. It should be the same at, if you're, regardless of what compliance pathway you're using.
I guess I sort of follow. I was just.
So take for example, if you did the prescriptive pathway, the least flexible pathway, the one that I like to say, thou shalt do, you have to do exactly what the prescriptive path tells you to do. You then did a energy rating index on that house. It should be close to equivalent to 50.
Yeah, it's just whenever you're making a code change, it's going to increase the cost of that pathway, right? So that's what.
Yeah, and if that's a sticking point, we
truthfully
can
saying, right?
check it differently, but
well, that. Yeah.
Feel like we might be talking across each other. I'm not sure if I'm making my point clear. Maybe someone else can try and do that.
I think you're clear, Robbie. I think that there's a difference of what is this? Is it increasing cost compared to current Denver code, or is it increasing cost compared to where Denver's other proposals are, or is it on parity with where other proposals are? And so maybe just to find how you've answered that question here, I think we really will be deferring to the code committee to vote on sort of is this the right path forward? And Nate, the thing, because I don't think you've been in all of these meetings, Denver has said we're going to take the next step towards net zero energy. And so we're looking for the committee to really help us to find the right way to do this. And so that sort of level of ambition was something that the city set for the committee. And then it's figuring out the right way to get there.
From that perspective, the way I answered this question was that the moving from the 2019 adoption in the city of Denver to this new adoption was going to increase costs regardless. So what I'm saying is that this code change proposal to change the energy rating index path doesn't change cost beyond that.
Got it. Yeah, maybe you can just add that in, just think that that's the interpretation here, Robbie. But do you have anything else, Nate, that you want to add just in terms of kind of technically how this proposal reads? I think just to say that we hear you on sort of like, we need to calibrate the level of ambition to be appropriate. So I think that the place we were going to have that discussion mostly today was a number of folks in the committee were going to review the number of the percent renewable required in that minimum renewable proposal. Right now it's set at 20%. And then the amount of efficiency that's equivalent to that, because that, of course, we just talked about layers on top of both the modeling pathway and the prescriptive pathway. And so if we think a lower level of ambition is needed, then that's something that this group could adjust, or the committee itself could actually adjust quite easily within the residential sphere, is adjusting that proposal versus adjusting the ERIs here. Does that make sense? Or is like where maybe that if you're all right, Nate, I might ask that we can turn to that next proposal with the caveat that like we could circle back to this, but.
No, it's the same concern that we've had all along, from the selection of the committee members to the lack of clarity on what code changes are gonna or how they're gonna impact the costs of construction moving forward. And it's just hasn't been a focus of those that are presenting these amendments or any other members, I guess, that have been on these committees. And it's unfortunate because there's going to be significant cost increases that, the Robbies and the Seans aren't looking at. And it's going to impact the buyers significantly. So that's just why I bring it up every time.
Thank you. But let's go through those other two proposals and keep that in mind as we go there. Sean, if you're willing to walk us through each of those in turn.
So let's go ahead and start right there at the top. One of the issues that has come up in some of the other working groups, and I think it's been less of an issue with this working group, but has still been mentioned, is the issue of emergency power and how that relates to all electric buildings. And so this impacts residential buildings a little bit less, but as we looked at the issue more closely, realized that it is still an issue for residential buildings. So what we've done is we've brought over a couple of definitions from the IBC and the fire code for emergency power system and standby power system. And then we have explicitly stated in the definition of all electric property that that doesn't include, any of this, the combustion equipment or any piping for combustion equipment that is used for emergency power systems or standby power systems. And the reason that we did it this way is because it's easy for us to think about the residential code as just being single family, particularly now that low-rise multifamily has been moved to the commercial code. But we do have R3 and R4 occupancies that are kind of these quasi-institutional occupancies, small occupancies that still have an institutional setting where emergency power or standby power could actually be required. And even if it's not required, it could be desirable. And then even in single family homes, you do have people with medical conditions for whom having emergency power could be really important. And so we decided to go ahead and put that exception for emergency power in the definition itself, because everybody's going to look at that definition when they see all electric property, and we have it in one place to be really abundantly clear. So this is the way that we've addressed kind of the backup power. We've also not distinguished between mandatory emergency power and voluntary emergency power or standby power, and just for simplicity's sake. And it would add a certain level of complication to this code to really try to distinguish between the two of them, probably not without a lot of benefit. So since this is a discrete topic, I thought it'd be useful to see if there's any feedback on this before we get into the main body where everything else is a little bit more interconnected. right. Well, hearing nothing, we'll go ahead and get to the rest of it. So you've seen this from our last meeting. Now, we've moved away from the offsite renewable requirement and simplified the exceptions so that all electric buildings, and this gets to Christine, what Christine was asking about, are exempt from the on-site renewable energy requirements to incentivize all electric properties. And then, but if you can't be all electric, you can meet this requirement through doing additional efficiency through R408. And then also an equivalent path through the ERI path, an equivalent option through the ERI path. So regardless of whether you're going ERI or prescriptive, you do have an efficiency path if on-site renewables just aren't possible. And then we did add this one last exception in this last round because the issue of small houses, so tiny houses or just small dwelling units came up. And because of that, we went ahead and added this one, and this is one of the things that we would like to discuss of whether this is the right threshold. So the city of Denver, in its, I believe it's in the zoning code, uses 1,000 square feet as a threshold already in how it treats ADUs. So that makes it convenient to use 1,000 because then it's, the requirements are consistent in these different places. But that is larger than we're seeing in other jurisdictions, and so we're hoping to see if you have any feedback.
I do want to chime in and say Rob Buchanan couldn't be here today, but he did send a recommendation for, I think it was 600 to 750 square feet.
I like that. 1,000 sounds a bit high.
I think probably one of the key questions is considering this benefit to having consistency with how these are treated in other parts of the code. That shouldn't shackle us, by any means, but when we look at the kinds of ADUs and tiny houses that are being built in Denver, is there a functional difference between those two thresholds? Like, is everything that's under 1,000 square feet also close to 600 or 500? Is that how the market is shaking out right now? Or is there a meaningful difference between these two thresholds? We do see in some jurisdictions where, it's either really small and under 600 square feet, or it's a full-size single-family home, that there isn't in between the two.
Thanks for that question, Sean. I might see if we could toss it to Mike Walton first, because I'd like to hear more about the 1,000 that is referenced elsewhere. I think you said that came from zoning limitations, and so I don't know if we sort of need to be consistent across Denver regulations also in your mind.
Yeah, so I think we based that on last code cycle. Our intent was to offer some relief for air changes per hour for ADUs, and then after looking at the zoning code and the allowances, we came down at 1,000. Typically, ADU sizes are regulated by the zone lot size. Let's see here. Let me pull something up. The footprint is generally what's limited here.
It's the rear 35, right, Mike?
The rear 35% of a zone lot, but if we're talking about area, so the smallest ADU footprint that people can have is 650 square feet. Then it goes to 864 from there. Then it goes from 1,000. But that's based on the footprint, and you can have a story and a half. A half story is 75% of the floor below. So you can have living space on the bottom level and on the upper level. So to limit it to what you says 650, you would be excluding a good amount of ADUs. Because even the smallest ADUs can have 650 square feet, as a footprint, and then have 3/4 of that on top.
Yeah.
Is it worth
Yeah,
separating out
and
detached ADUs from attached?
That would be another question, because right now as it's written, it's just dwelling units, conditioned floor area of 1,000. So that would capture attached. That would be duplexes or townhomes too, correct?
yeah, or should we actually directly reference ADUs? Because
Yeah, that's what I
But
was thinking.
ADUs are a zoning concept, not a building code concept.
we can't. Okay.
Right.
Mike, hearing that some of the working group members would like it to be a little smaller, like, would you be comfortable with that? I feel like, or would you just be a lot more comfortable if we're consistent across that definition from other places?
Yeah, I would be more comfortable with 1,000 square feet. Obviously, I'm not the final word on it or anything. But,
Yeah.
that's something that would make me more comfortable.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Mike, on that, because you may have someone who has a lot and it's only a 25 or 37 or whatever have you. We don't have that 50-foot lot. Well, that floor plan is going to be decreased in the size of square footage.
Yeah. And that is still a pretty small space. Are others just okay if we do that because it's a Denver precedent for ADUs? And there's a lot of reasons we want more ADUs to be built, right? From housing affordability, density is good for our climate benefit.
Random question. I don't know the answer to this, but is there a consideration on any other thresholds for plumbing, for sewer, for water, parking, any other kind of codified thresholds that relate to square footages that we need to consider in here?
Mike, I'm going to defer to you. Can you think of any others? I know that the 1,000 came from the air changes provisions where we excluded ADUs with the 1,000 square foot metric, right? But
Correct. That's the only division that I'm aware of.
yeah.
I think that the air tightness should be easier to achieve with a smaller unit. So I guess I'm sort of wondering why we have it in the first place.
So the reality is that air tightness, as measured in air changes per hour, is a volumetric measurement.
Right.
And it's harder to achieve 3 air changes per hour in a small unit than it is in a large unit. So
yeah, right.
The exception isn't that they don't have to do a blower door test and demonstrate compliance, but the metric, we're allowing them to use a CFM per square foot metric, which is really a better metric, especially for smaller dwelling units.
Okay.
Yeah, but then that just set a precedent and so maybe that makes that precedent not relevant to this because it's a different thing, right? But it is a precedent in the building code where there's an exclusion for ADUs.
Yeah, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the only reason that the precedent matters is that people building these houses are already using 1,000 square feet as a threshold for something. And so they're already thinking above 1,000, below 1,000. So if you add a different threshold, then that's just another threshold they have to keep in mind. And that impacts usability.
Right.
But if there's
I
a good
mean,
reason to have a different threshold, then it's not a full stop. It's not that you can't have 2 thresholds. So, but it's just that you should have a good reason if you're going to have more than one.
And maybe it's something we could reconsider the next code cycle. Like a lot of these proposals, we're taking an approach to we're trying to get started, right? And so let's go for simplicity and usability. It's things that I've heard from other working groups, but I'm wondering if folks are okay with that here. Okay, I think we're gonna leave it as a placeholder. Feel free to keep thinking about that. Chime back in if you don't agree. And
Can I ask one quick question? I think I'm probably just missing something here, but there's an allowance for prescriptive path to have 17 additional points to get up to 35. There's an allowance for the ERI to go 17 points lower. There's no workaround for performance, or does that just tie in with an additional 17 energy credits as well, just like prescriptive?
There's not one for performance, and we probably should have one. From a practical standpoint, I don't think you'd be able to do it under performance just because of how the system is limited. But I'm not sure of that, so we should probably just have it to make sure that we've covered all the bases.
I'm just curious if somebody, doesn't want renewables for whatever reason, maybe can't do it, and then they want, gas appliances and they want to do performance path. Is that off the table for them?
I don't think it should be.
Okay.
Do you want to add that here, Sean?
Courtney has it up, so I'll make a note of it.
Well, Sean, if you do type, it should show up here too.
Okay.
So if you want to, I just want to make sure people can see the language we're considering today.
We'll see how good SharePoint does at keeping everything synced up with everything live.
Okay. It'll sync in a moment, but maybe we can keep moving as soon as Sean's done typing. Right.
So the language needs a little bit refinement, but that shows the basic idea.
Great. Does that make sense? The 17% lower, Mike?
Yeah, and I mean, already for the additional energy efficiency package, it says performance has got to be 77% of the annual energy cost. Maybe this does handle it because it doesn't say prescriptive has to get 17 additional energy points. It just says building, and then if you go to performance, it says you have to comply with 408 and not include the measures.
Keep in mind, this is additional efficiency on top of what is already required for efficiency. So,
but wouldn't the 17 energy points apply to both performance and prescriptive?
It would
the 17 additional.
Yeah, it's an additional efficiency above and beyond what the base code is already asking.
So then maybe performance is taken care of by that exception number 2.
405 does have the option to just use R408 and just keep that stuff out of its calculation. It's
right.
I don't think that's really I don't think that's a great thing, but it's what's in the base code that we're working with already. So they could do it that way.
Okay.
I think having it laid out explicitly is best for greatest clarity and usability. So I'll make sure that the language is cleaned up and precise.
Okay.
Thank you both. I think our last big question on this proposal, and I wonder if it's almost better to circle back to after we review the last proposal, but let's just touch on it because then we only have 20 minutes left. So I want to move then to the next proposal. But does the overall stringency work now that you've had another week to think about it? What we were hearing last week, and we don't quite have the same people here, so we will follow up with some of the individuals like Brad from Thrive. There were a few others on the list who were specifically going to check this level of stringency, who I don't think are here. So we will also follow up with them. But just for those who are here, does this seem like I think the balance we're trying to strike is ambitious and in line with our climate goals, but doable. And so is this getting there? And maybe because I know not everyone was in the last meeting, it would be helpful to review the prescriptive path because this one layers on top of both. So I think to answer that question, you probably need to have seen all three. So unless somebody has something that's burning that they have to say right now, I might just move us through the prescriptive path and then turn to that kind of question for our wrap up. Okay, let's walk through prescriptive.
All right. So the first thing you'll note is, again, we've brought in this emergency power accommodation, and I don't think we need to discuss that again. We can go straight down to R408. And it probably makes sense to just go through these one by one. There, at our last working group, a question was asked about adding passive house levels, add credit options for passive house levels of infiltration and thermal envelope. And so we took a look, and passive house levels of infiltration are generally pretty close to what we already have in there of less than 1 ACH 50. It is an envelope metric instead of a volume metric, so it's squishy. You know, those two, you can correlate those two for a specific building geometry, but you can't um, correlate the two for all building geometries. But I ran it through just a couple of kind of standard boxy homes, and it came out in the kind of like 0.6 to 0.7, 0.8, so really close, and it didn't seem to really add a lot of value to go just a little bit more for another option. However, the high performance thermal envelope that is required by passive house and that kind of super insulated, we did that is a significant difference. And so we added a credit option, um, but weren't quite sure what the credits for that should be. All the other credits are based on modeling, and so we didn't model a super insulated um, a super insulated shell like this, and so we would need to have an educated, best estimate. But alternatively, this brought up for us based on our last discussion in the working group that we are allowing uh, passive house levels of envelope to be used to so that a building could use electric resistance and still gets the credits for space heating electrification. And so that could be seen as just, here's your passive house level of envelope and here's how you get the credits for them, because you're getting them by being able to do electrification very easily. So we're hoping to discuss with the working group, does that latter approach make sense, or should we have um, do we have a credit value that we think we can attach to just the insulation levels?
So I definitely defer to Robbie on this. It seems like this is his wheelhouse. But I think this came up from a comment I had made about adding a passive house level point system. At the time, my specific comment was on the air tightness, because there's an actual number that's required, which is 0.6. So it wasn't specifically thermal, because that varies depending on how the passive house energy model works out in terms of what's going to be required in the thermal envelope. But then as far as what numbers should be associated here, I don't know. So hopefully Robbie has some idea.
If he's not on the plane already.
Yeah, so you're asking what air tightness number?
They were asking what the credit value should be if you hit, say, passive house level of air tightness. So like, now looks like it's less than or equal to 2, less than or equal to 1. So my last suggestion had been, can we add a less than or equal to 0.6, which means that you're hitting passive house levels of air tightness. And so what the point value would be for that, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I was just sort of wanting to try and get some recognition of those specific numbers into the code so that people are sort of seeing references.
Yeah, so I think it's confusing because there's PHI, which is the European version of passive house, which is the 0.6. And then there's the FIAS, which is a 0.6 CFM per square foot. And they're quite, they calculate pretty differently for what it actually means for their tightness of the house. There, in the green code, there is allowance for utilizing passive house standards there. So I think it would be cleaner right now to keep that in that, and it's still going to be a pretty significant stretch for most builders to achieve the 2 and 1 air change per hour requirements now. And so I think it's something to keep in mind, potential for the next cycle. And we have something pointing to it right now in the Denver Green Code.
My question,
So for
Rick,
now, do we leave this as is? It sounded like Robbie was sort of saying take it out this code cycle, but alternately, should we just, you know?
No, right now it's saying I was saying is I would recommend not adding a passive house level air tightness number to this table.
Understood. Are others okay with that? Because it was a suggestion to add it last time.
I'm okay with it. That
Okay.
explanation made sense to me.
Okay. Sounds good. We'll take it out. Next thing, Sean.
So there's not a whole lot.
I'm sorry, Sean. When what you just crossed out says high performance thermal envelope, and that's different than an air change per hour number. High performance thermal envelope, you're talking about R values and U values of the thermal envelope. You're not necessarily talking about air leakage rate. So
Yeah, those are two separate things. So in the last working group, the discussion of the leakage rate, Jonathan that brought up, then triggered also the question of, well, what about passive house levels of insulation? So Jonathan may not have made both of those suggestions, but he did trigger both of them. And
okay, so
as we discussed, we didn't seem like the infiltration rate was big enough to make the difference, but the high performance thermal envelope, the passive house level of thermal envelope seemed like maybe it would, but we were bumping up against this issue of how many credits do we get to it? And since you can get electrification credits for it anyway, is that okay? Is that enough? So maybe we should explicitly discuss that question. And we can go down to 408.3.4, Courtney. So the way that it is phrased now, it is, you would have to use the passive house methodology or a similar methodology to calculate your peak thermal heating load and then match your thermal envelope to that. So it's not just a set of R values or U factors. It is using this more sophisticated method. But is the electrification inclusion enough, or do we need to have this? And then, like we said, that question for this group, what would be the credit value of that? Anyone who has experience with passive house and how far beyond it, how far it goes beyond the R values and U factors in the code would be useful.
Yeah, so it depends specifically on the house, because as you say, a passive house standard doesn't have a prescriptive R value table. For example, it's all based off of this BTU per hour, and you're developing a thermal envelope to meet that requirement there. That said, the R values are usually at the top range of the 2021, which would be that our cavity R value of R30 in our climate zone. And there's something else I was going to say that slipped my mind.
Well, I guess the question isn't, what would the R values be, but what kind of energy savings are we seeing from passive houses versus a building with a standard thermal envelope?
Yeah. So if you equate a passive house, a common passive house to it being evaluated using the home energy rating index scale, if we're shooting for a 50 with the energy rating index scale, a passive house is generally going to come in at the range of 35 to 40 in that scale. So that gives you kind of an idea.
And not all of those savings are coming from the thermal envelope, but a good It's the lion's share, would you say, is coming from the thermal envelope?
I would maybe 3/4.
So with those kind of performance points in mind, we could estimate a credit value for this. It wouldn't be based on modeling. It would be a best estimate from anecdotal data, but sometimes that's how we do things. Is that good enough for this group, or do we think it makes sense to just avoid this one entirely?
Do you mind if I ask a silly question? The consideration of including these numbers, what's the outcome? What's the gain? Is it about giving extra credit for the passive house efforts, or is it and are those efforts being credited somewhere else? I mean, for someone's not going to just go build a passive house because they them a little bit more in the Denver code. They're going to build a passive house because that's what they want. That's what they're asking for. They have other motivations for that. So sorry, maybe just looking at the clarification of the motivations for this.
I think your point is very valid about passive house is the type of thing that people do because it's passive house. It does add some flexibility to how those sorts of homes would comply with the code. I think there is also a market transformation element to it because it would make uh, non-passive house projects, at least it would bring it to their awareness and have them start thinking about it. And so maybe start the beginning of that market transformation when it comes to envelope performance. But those are the sorts of impacts that we're talking about. I would say that
Right,
probably
and
none of them are significant, but I would say that those impacts they may not be significant, but they are real, and it's not increasing stringency, it's only increasing flexibility. So there's really not a downside to it.
And if I recall correctly, it was trying to capture recognition of the envelope of the various features of a passive house prior to the passive house being completed, because if you're earning passive house, you earn it after the fact with stringent targets and thresholds and markers along the way, and we're just trying to recognize that along the way prior to completion, correct?
Mm-hmm. And also encourage people who aren't doing passive house to consider a super insulated envelope because it's still a really good design choice. And when we think of approach to energy efficiency, it's not always the most cost effective, but it is one of the most effective and durable energy efficiency things that you can do in a building. And then I think the last thing that I'd say is this approach of looking at peak heating or cooling demand is starting to become more common in the codes as kind of this is a different way to think of efficiency, and it's a really good way to think of efficiency. And so to introduce that here kind of does help with that market transformation beyond just passive house. To be thinking of your peak heating and cooling demand as a basis for design and a basis of thinking about efficiency.
Okay, I haven't heard any opposition to including this, so if that's okay, maybe we can move on and let Sean and Robbie figure out kind of how many points to assign credits.
All right, and then
Sean, I just had
question
one other thing to that too.
Yeah.
The number that you're using, I don't know if that's maybe the FIAS number. I'm not as familiar with their number for the peak load.
It is the FIAS number.
Okay.
And I don't know how the what is that internecine
Yeah.
how the interreligious dialogue works on that and the implications of it for Denver, but
yeah, that's a little bit looser than the PHI number, but
one last thought on it real quick is that going into passive house, you're going to have calculations done ahead of time, and so maybe just using it sort of as a against baseline type of approach. And so if they use that threshold, if they use that calculation to say, and it's X% better than prescriptive path or what have you, something like that, just to simplify the whole thing.
That's actually not easy to calculate that number. What percentage better? It's not a fixed number. It's dependent on lots of things.
Well, I think that Robbie and I can work on what that credit value should be, and we can introduce that in there, and then it is just this additional flexibility, tiny little bit of a hint of market transformation and market education point, and that will be its purpose. I probably should go to the last thing, which is really just an information. I don't think there's anything to discuss. If we go down, yeah, there was a typo corrected here, and then heat energy recovery. We did just add the extra words so that it was really, really clear that energy recovery is heat recovery. When we looked at it, it was only in the main title that it only said energy recovery. Everywhere else it said heat or energy recovery, but titles are important, so we just made that consistent. And those are the only things that we discussed last time. And I think that we've addressed them all.
Thanks, Sean. We only have, 3 minutes left. I think we need to have a robust discussion at some point on sort of overall stringency. I'd like to have some of the folks who in particular were vetting some of the numbers with us in the last meeting join to really look at how achievable some of these are. But I thought, I guess I'd love feedback just in terms of process at this point over the last couple of minutes, because we can't have that discussion in 2 minutes. Mike, I saw you came off mute. Anything else on your mind? And I think we could use the next meeting for that. We also can just follow up offline with the folks who were checking this and check in with them. But any thoughts on process?
Not so much process. I think I would just want to echo what I think Chuck communicated to you and myself about costs for the credits. I think that breakdown would be valuable, not only for this group, but certainly when we move into the committee. I think those questions are going to be coming. So if we're prepared, that'd be a head start.
Okay, that's super helpful. That was a key thing we wanted feedback on. And I think then if we meet again, that can inform a discussion about that overall level of stringency. Sean, I think that was something you thought you could pull together by the next meeting. Can you dive in and see if we can have cost estimates for the credits? Because I think that will help us vet stringency. You're muted.
We should have a discussion about that.
Okay. Mike, we will work to pull that together. Because I think you're right that will be useful so that other committee members don't just have to rely entirely on the residential experts as they're thinking through this. I think we had a lot of the residential expert committee members here, plus some additional folks. Yeah. Anything else? And I'm happy to take feedback offline too. Or, like Nathan, this is the first time I'd seen you in one of these meetings. I don't want to dismiss what you were saying. I'm happy to sort of walk you through what the process, I feel like we went through a really big process to have open applications for the committee and seat the committee. But we really value your technical input, even if you're not one of the committee members. That's why we have a more open working group process. So if you want to follow up offline, we're happy to do that. Also, just to think through what data can help us make decisions on that overall level of stringency. Does anyone else have just process suggestions? And then I guess we will use your last meeting. We won't wrap up today to, in particular, kind of talk about what this group wants to recommend in terms of overall level of stringency. Okay, with that, we'll wrap up for today to be respectful of your time, and we'll talk in 2 weeks. Thanks all.
Thanks.